Hello and thanks for tuning in. Today we are heading into the Pacific to build something a little different, a crashed Grumman Wildcat surrounded by the clear blue waters of a tropical ocean diorama made of epoxy resin. For the cockpit I'm using an Eduard aftermarket set which offers significantly more detail than the original kit parts. I recently hit an armor modeling wonder why we aircraft modelers spend so much time detailing cockpits when, in the end, you can barely see any of it. Well, there's only one answer to that. Welcome to the dark side, we have cockpits. But before we continue working on our soon to be almost invisible cockpit, a quick word from today's video sponsor. This video is sponsored by Gaahleri and their new Aventus 2 airbrush. It's their latest high-end airbrush and they've put a lot of thought into making it lightweight, comfortable and really precise. You've got both 0.2 and 0.4mm setups, so you've got everything from fine detail work to large coverage in one package. And right now, Gaahleri Day 2026 is in full swing, running from August through September. There are discounts up to 48% across the store, along with new product launches, flash sales, games and special offers throughout the event. So if you've been thinking about picking up a new airbrush, some paints or just adding a few new tools to your workbench, now might be a pretty good time to have a look. If the Aventus 2 looks like something you like to add to your workbench, you'll find the link in the description. Big thanks to Gaahleri for supporting the channel, and now let's get back to the build. I haven't mentioned it yet, but earlier I removed some of the molded on details with a hobby knife, and now you can see why I needed a flat surface for the 3D decals. The Second World War may have been pretty rough, but that doesn't mean our pilot has to sit on a hard seat. So I used some Tamagia quick setting putty to make him a little cushion. And after the crash, at least he have something to cuddle with while he waits for rescue. I dry brushed some lighter colors onto the seat to bring out the details and give it a bit more depth. The seatbelts look really nice, but getting them into the right position takes quite a bit of patience. I added some pigments here and there, and with that done, it's already time to put the cockpit together and fit it into the fuselage. There's always a little Grand Canyon somewhere. I filled the gaps between the two fuselage halves with putty, let it dry for about 24 hours and then sanded everything smooth. Time to do something you would normally try to avoid. As I mentioned, this Wildcat is going to be a crashed aircraft, so now it's time to start adding some serious damage. And the first step is cutting off part of the wing. The plastic is a little too thick on the inside, so I filed it down first and then used a rotary tool to make it even thinner. To make the damaged wing look more realistic, I'm using some self-adhesive aluminum foil. The thin metal can be bent, torn and crumpled much more naturally than plastic, which helps recreate the look of a damaged aircraft skin. A little superglue putty helps blend the aluminum foil into the plastic and makes the transition look much more natural. Inside the wing you normally find structural ribs and spars, so I scratch built a few of those to make the exposed damage more convincing. And of course a few loose wires and cables can't be missing either. Now it's time to attach the wings to the fuselage. And to add a few more scratch build parts to the damaged areas. Normally I would do the pre-shading with an airbrush, but for this model I wanted to try something different. Instead, I'm using two different sponges to triple small white spots onto the surface, almost like sponge chipping. The two sponge textures give me a different pattern and levels of coverage. One downside is that I'm using acrylic paint for this, and in some areas I applied it a little too thick. Later, when I sprayed the much thinner lacquer based coat over it, some of those spots left a slightly raised texture on the surface. So if you try this technique yourself, I would recommend lightly sanding the sponge work before applying the main color. That's one step I skipped here. Now I apply the main blue color in several thin layers, making sure the pre-shading still shows through underneath. On some of the panels I use different grades of sanding paper to add scratches and wear. And yes, I'm literally sanding the paint I just spent all the time applying. I wasn't completely happy with the look yet, so I added a little post shading. For this I mixed the main blue color with some white and sprayed it onto the center of selected panels to add more variation and depth. By the way, do you like what you are seeing? Then please consider subscribing and leaving a like so you don't miss any of my future videos. Even better, leave a comment below. The YouTube algorithm especially loves those. Without your support, the chances of my small channel like mine being recommended to other models are about as good as Germany winning the next World Cup. So yeah, I could really use your help. Thank you. Okay, now it's time for the decals. First I apply some micro set into the area where the decal will go. Then I carefully place the decal into position. The micro set helps it settle onto the surface and make it easier to move around until everything is aligned. Next I use a soft brush to gently push out any air bubbles trapped underneath the decal and press it down onto the surface. After letting everything dry for a few minutes, I apply some microsol. This softens the decal and helps it conform to the surface, especially around panel lines, rivets and other small details. After a while, the decal settles nicely into most of the panel lines and holes, but not all of them. A little trick I learned recently is to skip brushing your tooth before breakfast and use the toothbrush for something far more important, gently tapping the decals into the stubborn holes. This helps push it into place and fills the holes nicely, I mean the holes on the model of course, not the ones in your teeth. In my B70 build, some of you mentioned that the carrier film on Eduard decals can actually be removed. I didn't dare to try it before, but it turns out to be surprisingly easy. First I brush some odorless thinner over the decals and let it sit for about 30 seconds. Then using a flat brush I carefully lift and remove the carrier film. Unfortunately, especially around curved areas, part of the decal can come off together with the carrier film, as you can see here. But that's not a big problem as long as you have the right paint at hand. The color might be slightly different from the decal, but I think that actually adds a bit of character, and after the weathering it should be barely noticeable. Speaking of weathering, I apply a wash over the model and let it dry for about 40 minutes. Then I use a makeup sponge and cotton swab to remove almost all of it, leaving just enough behind to bring out the panel lines and details. Another one of my favorite weathering techniques is oil dot filtering. I place tiny dots of oil paint across the surface and then blend them with a brush damped with a odorless thinner. It creates subtle color variation and makes the finish look much more interesting. Next we move on to the engine. For this I'm using an aftermarket set from SBS, which gives us a much more detailed starting point. And as Inflames recently said on Discord, radial engines are just a lot of fun to paint. Speaking of Discord, we have a small and friendly community over there, and you are more than welcome to join us. You find fellow scale modelers to share your builds with, or people like me who are still trying to become proper modelers and have plenty of questions to ask. You find the link to our Discord server in the description, and of course it's completely free. So come by, show us what you are working on, or just have a chat. I'd be very happy to see you there. With the engine in place, it's time to take care of our pilot. I first sprayed the figure with black primer, followed by white paint sprayed from above. This is called the zenithal highlighting and gives me a simple guide for where the light would naturally hit the figure, where the lower areas stay darker and in shadow. After that I built up the colors with several thin layers of paint mixed with glaze medium. The glaze medium makes the paint more transparent, so the highlights and shadows underneath can still show through. By slowly adding a layer after layer, I can build up the color without losing the contrast. And with that, our pilot is ready to head out on his wet adventure. Now it's time to build the diorama. I start by cutting a piece of styrofoam to size, which will serve as the base for our little piece of Pacific Ocean. Unfortunately, I couldn't find styrofoam thick enough for the whole base, so I have to build up the beach area by gluing an additional piece on top. I seal the two pieces together with Tamiya epoxy putty, making sure there are no gaps where the epoxy resin could leak out later. Next I add a layer of gesso. This was probably a little unnecessary, as I was hoping it could already serve as a base for the next steps, as it turns out not quite. So instead I slap on a layer of Moltofill to create the rough texture I want for the base. It also helps seal the surface, which is important because the last thing I want to is expensive epoxy resin finding a tiny gap and escaping all over the table. I originally hoped to use the AK Interactive Sand Beach texture as the sand itself, but once dry it didn't look quite as convincing as I expected. To me it looked more like yellow textured paint than actual sand. But since I already had it, I used it as a base for some fine modeling sand from our friends in the model railway world. I don't cover everything completely though. Letting some of the beach texture show through here and there creates a nice mix of colors and texture and makes the beach look much more natural. The sand is fixed in place with AK Interactive Sand and Gravel Fixer, so it won't start floating around once I add the epoxy and resin later. I wasn't completely happy with the color though, so I sprayed a very thin layer of slightly warmer, more yellowish sand color over the entire diorama. Of course, we can't have a Pacific Island scene without a coral reef, well, at least a small part of one. This is also a good opportunity for me to finally try out some Citadel contrast paints. They are mainly designed for miniature painting like Warhammer, so there aren't too many obviously uses for them in military modeling. Contrast paints are quite thin and transparent. They naturally flow into the deeper areas while leaving the raised details lighter, giving you shadows, base color and some highlights in a single step. And for something as irregular and colorful as coral, that sounds pretty much perfect. And yes, maybe my coral reef is a little too colorful. Real color reefs are often much more faded, but hey, we are building a diorama here, not a scientific exhibit. Now it's time to add the epoxy resin. This needs around 27 hours to fully cure. If you are working with epoxy resin at home, make sure to use it in a well ventilated area and never make the layer thicker than the manufacturer recommends. Also make sure to wear a mask. Once the epoxy resin has fully cured, I use a transparent gel to create the wave texture on the surface. While the gel is still wet, I use gentle bursts of air from the airbrush to push and shape it. This breaks up the smooth surface and creates smaller, more natural looking ripples and wave patterns, rather than having everything look too uniform. If you look closely, you can see that something happened to the sand while the epoxy was curing, leaving this strange wavy texture on top. And unfortunately, this same thing happened on the model itself. At first I thought it was because I forgot to add a very thin layer of epoxy before adding the rest. But I tried that on a test piece and exactly the same thing happened again. So maybe the epoxy simply doesn't get along with the varnish. Since I haven't had this problem before, my guess is that the current heatwave here in Europe may have played a part. The room was quite warm, so perhaps the epoxy got too hot while curing and affected the varnish underneath. It's definitely a little flaw, and no, this diorama probably won't win any awards because of it, but luckily I think the waves hide it pretty well. Speaking of which, it's time to add the waves. For this I first mix a paste using AK Interactive water gel effects and some snow sprinkles. The snow sprinkles are a little darker than I want, so I add some white acrylic paint to brighten everything up. I apply the mixture with a round brush, then use an old brush to stipple and dab it onto the surface. I keep repeating this process, slowly building up the texture until I get the wave and C-form effect I'm looking for. The lighter and thicker AK water form paste is perfect for adding the final highlights to the waves. I apply it mainly to the highest points and along the wave crest, where the water will naturally break and create bright white foam. This gives the waves more depth and makes the surface look much more dynamic. Last but not least, I add some vegetation to the beach, including small bushes, palm trees and a few other tropical details. I also apply some wet effect oil to the Wildcat, especially around the areas in contact with the water. After all, a crashed airplane sitting in the Pacific probably shouldn't look completely dry. And here it is, the finished Wildcat and Pacific Ocean diorama. This build definitely had a few surprises along the way, but I'm really happy to see the whole scene finally come together. I hope you enjoyed today's episode. If you did, please consider leaving a like and subscribing to the channel. And if you have any thoughts, questions or feedback about the build, leave a comment below. I always enjoy reading them. Thank you so much for watching. I'll see you in the next one, and until then, happy building.